we think failure is like only a bad thing, then we're never gonna have more entrepreneurs. True entrepreneurship, it's a very meritocratic thing. Nobody cares whether you worked at McKinsey or you worked at Goldman Sachs. Aside from maybe getting married, this might be the most important relationship in your life. And it might even be as important as that. YC is not investing in an application, right? They're investing in a business. Now with AI and LLMs, problems that couldn't have been solved before are now finally solvable.
It's a big risk. It's scary. The company might fail. You might be out of a job in 12 months. To start a company today, what would you say to them? What would be your advice? Before we start this episode, I want to flag that only 5% of you are subscribed to the channel. So please do consider subscribing, as it does help out the channel and does help bring out better guests in the future. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulullah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Rabii is the founder and CEO of Remo AI, an AI compliance startup based between San Francisco and the Middle East that he started last year at the age of 25. Since starting the company, he's raised millions of dollars in funding from leading Silicon Valley investors, including YCombinator, and scaled the company to hundreds of thousands in revenue in a number of months. Rabii studied PPE at Oxford University and began his career at McKinsey before transitioning to the startup world. In this conversation, I want to discuss how he started his entrepreneurial journey, advice for Muslims wanting to build a company, and discuss some of the blockers for Muslims wanting to start a company today. Rabii, welcome to the Muslim Founder. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
All good. People from our generation, we're both Muslims, we're both Pakistani, both grew up in the UK. We're supposed to be, doctors, lawyers, engineers. Where did you get this idea that you wanted to start a company? How did that come about? Did you just wake up one day and want to leave your job?
I wish it was that straightforward. I think, look, we all have our own journeys, right? For me, a lot of it came from the people around me. So my older brother started a company, so that kind of showed me that it was possible. And I think in our communities, entrepreneurship is often still a thing. Like many of our family members have businesses, and it's always like this idea, I'm going to start a business one day. And so for me, like starting a startup is not so different actually, right? It's like the modern version of the same idea.
But it's not like, the traditional shops or pharmacy or dentist that someone would go down to. We don't really see like tech entrepreneurs from our own community.
It's true, but I think it's changing. And I think like the moment we realize that like being a lawyer, being a doctor, being an engineer are not the only career paths, and that there is like a viable career path in being an entrepreneur, I think we open up a lot of doors. And then also the second piece is like how we deal with failure. Like being an entrepreneur means that you'll always have like examples of failure. If we think failure is like only a bad thing, then we're never gonna have more entrepreneurs, right?
Makes sense.
If we recognize the positives that come from failure, then more people might be encouraged to become entrepreneurs.
Yeah. Take me back to when you're like 20 years old. You're at Oxford University, you're studying. Did you know that eventually you wanted to start a company? Because at that stage, you're probably applying for internships and grad schemes.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I actually did like a couple of student entrepreneurship things while I was at university. I actually started my first company while I was at university as well. We made a lot of mistakes at that time. We did basically everything wrong. But through that experience learned, and like in hindsight, that's kind of helped us this time around as well. But to put it short, when I was supposed to be studying for my exams, I was watching YC YouTube videos. So by the time I was graduating, I knew sort of that I wanted to start a company eventually.
How come you went to McKinsey first? Is it because, you didn't know you wanted to start a company now? Or is it like a specific reason you wanted to go to like a big consulting firm or a big corporate first?
Yeah, so kind of the same reason why we don't see entrepreneurs, right? Which is that I wanted the safe option. Because I was not going to become a lawyer, engineer, or a doctor, a consultant was like the next best thing. And so honestly, I went for the safe option is the first piece. And then also I convinced myself that I needed real world experience. I needed to learn how big organizations work, which there are benefits to working at like a larger organization. But the reality is I was just doing it for the safety net.
Do you think that kind of paid off as well? Because obviously McKinsey is a big brand name. Do you think that kind of helped you in your entrepreneur journey as well? It comes with its own branding experience as well, right?
Definitely, like you have to learn to leverage it, right? You have to learn to like make the most of it. So I think the role that I got after McKinsey, I worked at a different startup for 2.5 years. I think being at McKinsey kind of helped. It helped open the door. It helped people take me seriously, especially like at a younger age. But I do think that ultimately, like one thing I love about like true entrepreneurship is it's a very meritocratic thing. You have to build something, you have to sell something, and frankly, nobody cares whether you worked at McKinsey or you worked at Goldman Sachs. Like, if your product is good, you win.
Yeah.
And for me, that's like really exciting as well.
You mentioned YC, you're binge watching a lot of YC content.
Yeah.
What is YCombinator? What is it? What's the program?
Yeah. So YCombinator is the leading startup accelerator in the world, based in San Francisco in Silicon Valley. And they've backed companies like Airbnb, Stripe, a bunch of others that are, large household names. And basically the way the program works is they invest into your company, and then you spend 3 or 4 months in San Francisco. Basically, every day you'll focus on building a company, and then every other day or every few days there'll be events, talks, mentorship from some of like the best startup founders in the world. And it culminates in demo day, where the idea is that you go out and raise a funding round. And then the real point of YC is to kickstart your company and give you the momentum to sort of build something massive. But yeah, that's YC in a nutshell.
YC is highly coveted, like you mentioned as well. I think the acceptance rate is like 1% or 2%, something like this as well.
Yeah.
Mashallah, you guys were very fortunate to like get into the program. Talk to us about, the application process. You guys went from ideation to applying for YC. You guys didn't have a company before. Talk to us about that process, applying for YC, getting into the program. What did you do over those 3 months?
Yeah, that's it. So yeah, let me talk about applying first. When we applied, we didn't have a product. Obviously, so what does YC look for, right? YC is looking for people who can build a product and who can sell a product, right? So within the founding team, that's the two things that they're really looking for. And then third thing is that they're looking for that this product can become something huge, right? So to really oversimplify, those are the three things that they're screening for. And so how do they screen for those things? They have a pretty thorough application process. If you're in the startup world, I would highly recommend going and just looking at the application process, because it definitely gives you a picture of what investors are looking for, what best practices, what things you should be focusing on. And then they really ask you to be very straightforward and simple in your answers. A lot of people try and use jargon when they're pitching, and they try and make things look like a lot cooler than it might be. But YC partners have seen everything, right?
They can see right through it.
They can see right through it. And then actually, if you have an interview, the interviews are very short. They're less than 10 minutes long. I think it was like 7 minutes or something. And then literally the next 6 hours later, they told us that we got in, right? And so those interviews, they'll get straight to the heart of if you try to, talk about things in a bit of a roundabout way, they would, they probably wouldn't even invite you to an interview. And if they do, they would very clearly focus on that piece and try and get to the truth.
What do you think people get wrong with submitting an application? Because I know you were mentoring and helping a lot of people do these kind of applications. You submitted applications before in the past as well. What did you get wrong then and that you did right when you got accepted?
Yeah, so I applied twice before, and then this was the third time that I applied. So a couple of things. The first 2 times I applied, it was kind of like applications where I was hoping that I would get in and then I would go and build this business. This time around was probably the first time where I knew that I was going to start a business this year. And I thought it would have been like that in the same direction as the initial application. And I thought it would be with the same people that I was applying with. And so I had already done a lot of work in that direction. Rather than me just putting together an application, I had gone and spoke to potential partners. I had gone and spoke to potential customers. So I was actually moving in the direction of building a business rather than just doing an application. And so YC is not investing in an application, right? They're investing in a business. And frankly, not just a business, they're investing in the founders behind the business. And so if you're not really building anything, and if you're just talking about an idea, it's very unlikely that you get in. So even though we got in without a product, I wouldn't say we got in with just an idea, because we had actually done a lot of work towards validating the idea.
And the idea that you guys actually applied with is not the company that you're building today.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you think it's still important to do the groundwork, even though that you ended up not building that company?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Because we pivoted about 2 weeks into YC. So when we started YC, we were focusing on international payments like remittances, and then we decided to pivot into building AI tools for compliance teams, serving the segment that we would have been. So we would have been the bank or fintech who would have consumed this product, but we wouldn't have known to build what we're building today if we hadn't started building the first version of our product. And about a third of YC companies pivot during the batch, based on my experience. I'm sure that people would have different numbers there, but a lot of companies do. And you only know that you should pivot if you try and sell something.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you have no idea, right? You're kind of flailing in the dark.
Okay. Tell me about your company. What is Remo AI? What's your startup?
Yeah, so at Remo, we build AI tools for compliance teams. We help banks and fintechs go through manual processes that they might have as part of, again, their compliance team. And we automate those. We help them get through those processes faster, for cheaper, and more accurately. Our core product right now is helping banks and fintechs onboard their business customers. So when a bank is onboarding a business customer, normally an analyst would pick up the case. It would take 2 or 3 hours for them to go through all the documentation, to look into the online presence of the business, to make sure that they're sort of ticking all the boxes they need to tick to make sure that they've onboarded the customer properly and in a way where they understand the risk that they're taking on. We automate that process end to end. And so instead of it taking 2 or 3 hours for you to have that account at the end of the onboarding process, we can offer that instantly. And so, yeah, that's Remo in a nutshell.
Sounds very technical. How did you know that, this was the problem that you wanted to fix? Because like you mentioned before as well, like, you applied for with a different idea, but you ended up pivoting into this idea. How did that come about? How did you know that this was the thing that you wanted to solve?
That's a great question. So I worked for a year at McKinsey, and then after that I spent 2.5 years at a fintech startup called Telda. Telda is a neobank. It's consumer focused, but I spent a lot of time, I was leading international expansion. And so I spent a lot of time setting up our compliance function, and looking into sort of like software that was out there. And so I already knew that this was a pain point. At that time, we looked at a lot of solutions, we built a lot of things in-house, and we realized very quickly that most stuff kind of solves half the problem. Now with AI and LLMs getting as good as they are today, I very quickly realized that like problems that couldn't have been solved before are now finally solvable. And so I did have the sort of nugget of the idea already from my experience at Telda. But then when we decided that we were going to pivot, my co-founder Hashim and I, we basically went back to all the fintechs that we were, or banks that we were looking at partnering with for the first business. And we just asked them, what are your problems, right? We didn't tell them, hey, we're building this. Are you interested? We just asked them, like, what are the things that you're spending money on? What are the things that stress you out? How are you thinking about your business over the next 12, 18, 24 months? And this compliance piece kept coming up again and again. And there was a lot of directions, right? Like some people wanted us to build very specific things. Others wanted us to build things that, only work for them. And so what we asked ourselves is like, what's the pattern amongst these like 50 to 100 companies that we spoke to? And it came up, like I said, again and again, that business onboarding was a massive pain point. And for us, it was also something that was quickly solvable. It was something that we could build an MVP for quickly. It's something where the overall product does take time to build, but it's easy to validate. And so then what we did is we built the MVP and just tried to sell it as much as possible.
What's an MVP?
The MVP is the minimum viable product. So it's a version of the product which maybe doesn't do everything it needs to do. It's not the sort of thing that you might sell publicly, but it's the type of thing that you can get someone using like very quickly.
Yeah, like a tester kind of thing.
A tester, exactly.
Yeah. So when you guys first had this idea, the first thing you did is like speak to these companies, validate there was a real issue. You went back to the drawing board and be like, okay, these are the data points from the companies that we've spoken to, and this is what we think the problem is that we want to try to solve.
Exactly.
After that, like what does the next 30 days look like for that?
That's a good question. So we did a combination again of like, and this is like standard YC advice and standard like Silicon Valley advice. At the pre-product market fit, at the early stages of your company, you should only really be doing two things: building your product and talking to users. That's the only two things you need to be doing. Everything else is a distraction. Now, building your product can eventually mean hiring people to help build your product, and it can mean designing things, and it can mean updating your website, etc. So that it's not just the core of your product. And talking to customers doesn't always have to be talking to customers face to face. It could be it could be cold emails. It could be calling them up. It could be going on podcasts so that people will listen to it, right? But these are the only two things that you should be doing. And for our first 30 days, that's all we did. We built the product and we spoke to customers. And Hashim, my co-founder, is technical and has been an engineer for the last 4 or 5 years. And so he was very focused on building out the product. And on my side, I was just reaching out to as many fintechs and banks that would talk to us. And the purpose of that was, one, to, again, try and sell something that frankly didn't exist yet. And number two is try to get more and more of an understanding of what the product needs to look like. Because again, we understood compliance, but we understood it not from an operational perspective, right? And so from an operational perspective, there's a lot of nuance that you start to learn about that frankly you wouldn't know unless you sit with the compliance team and start like looking at how they work. And so that was kind of our aim, is like, can we sit with them and just understand what are the problems so that we can solve them at a higher level? You
mentioned reaching out to customers. What was the process of finding your first customers? Say, your target customer is like banks and fintechs. Is it just a case of cold reach, or is it like asking for introductions? How did you like engage those conversations?
Yeah, so in the early days, I mean, it's still the early days, but for the first couple of months, I primarily did, I looked for warm introductions. And so the way I would do that is go on LinkedIn and see people who are willing to make introductions to me, who are they connected to? And then I would specifically say, could you connect me to X person? Here's a blurb, like, here's what we're doing. And then they would typically do it, and normally requires a lot of follow-ups. And then the second is the cold outreach. I actually primarily use LinkedIn in the beginning. I've started doing email as well now, but before I use LinkedIn, and LinkedIn's good because you can engage with people on not just their DMs, right? You can actually like their posts and comment on their posts. And then all of a sudden you start to build a bit of a rapport as well. So that's been pretty good. And that was kind of, those were the first two ways that we got our initial customers. Yeah.
A big part of running a startup is raising funds. And you guys, raise a couple $1 million now. Talk to me about the process. How does one, go from having an idea, speaking to customers, potentially having an MVP, to like raising funds from, large investors?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, YC does a good job of teaching you what investors are looking for. And at a fundamental level, it is the same across all investors. However, of course, different investors will weight more on different things, right? So some people want to de-risk a lot by seeing a product that is functional and used by customers. Others are looking more for the potential of the business and how differentiated it is, whether you have some unique advantage. And so they're looking for some combination of these things. Again, YC has great advice for this. I highly recommend that people go and look at YC's fundraising videos. But in a nutshell, the better your business is, the easier fundraising is. And so the more you improve your business, the more customers you have, the more revenue you make, the better retention you have, the easier fundraising should be. And then what you typically do is you make a deck, and that deck is typically a snapshot of your business. And that deck's main purpose is to basically get investors interested in wanting to have a conversation with you. And then from there, it's just about, again, having those conversations and convincing investors that you're the right team to build this business, and that business is going to be huge. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's the process. But there's a lot of resources out there. I highly recommend looking at the YC ones.
Makes sense. If you're advising, a young Muslim, say a graduate university student who wants to start a company today, what would you say to them? What would be your advice?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say fundraising should be like the 10th thing that you think about. It definitely should not be the first thing that you think about. A lot of people say like, I'm going to raise money first. And it's like, probably not the best idea. Just because, again, if you have nothing to show for it, you just have an idea, it's just hard for someone to put money there. So I think the biggest advice I would say is like, number one, surround yourself with other people that are building. This is why San Francisco is such an amazing place, but you can create those microcosms anywhere. And if you can't find those people in real life, just like find them on Twitter or the internet, which is just as powerful. And then the second thing I'd say is start building as quickly as possible. Like that's honestly the most important thing. Especially at the early days, if you frankly don't have any industry experience, you're much, much better off building a specific product for a specific person really quickly and then trying to generalize from there. And then the third thing, which is kind of linked to the second thing, is launch as quickly as possible. Like the idea of launching is, like YC again says this, like you should launch multiple times. Some companies launch like once every month. If you go on Notion, for example, Notion launches on, like I'm sure everyone is familiar with Notion, it's a software for productivity. They launch on Product Hunt like once every 3 or 4 months. If you look at Apple, like they have their keynotes, right? They're launching like regularly. So like who are we to like launch like once every year or launch once and never launch again? Right? So yeah, the threshold to launching is very low. It should be like a Google form.
One big thing is having someone to build with a co-founder. You yourself, you're not a technical co-founder. By that, I mean that you don't code, you don't know how to write software. What's that process of, like finding someone, knowing who to partner up with? Talk to me about your own journey and any good advice you have for finding a co-founder.
Yeah, I definitely recommend finding a co-founder. Although, again, it's not like the only thing. And frankly, the younger you are, the easier it is for you to spend more of your time learning how to code, especially with like all the AI tools out there, like Cursor, etc. Like I've used some of them. I won't say I've like built software end to end, but like it is definitely doable. And I've seen people do it. So if you have the time, I'd highly recommend like learning, even if you're going to look for a co-founder. In terms of looking for a co-founder, look, I think the most important thing is trust. If you're going to build a venture-backed business, you're in it for the long run. Like 7 to 10 years is like the low end, frankly. And so, aside from maybe getting married, this might be the most important relationship in your life. And it might even be as important as that. And so spend a lot of time on trust and making sure that like it's somebody that you actually want to spend these like 10, 12, 14 hours of every single day and like being really stressed with. So me and my co-founder Hashim, we knew each other for a few years. And actually when I was doing a short list of like people I might want to start a business with, I was frankly, I was optimizing for like, are they technical for sure, right? But then beyond like that base level of they can build a product, I was actually looking for who do I trust and do I want to build this business with? And obviously that list then ends up being kind of short. So I would say like for me, alhamdulillah, I was lucky that, mine and Hashim's timelines aligned and we sort of, it was right time as well. We both trusted each other. It sort of worked out. If none of the people on my list were like it was the right time for them, then I would have had to go out there and try and meet new people. Then again, there are some good websites out there. YC has co-founder matching. And then just, especially if you're at university, it's a great time to meet
Yeah.
technical people. So you can be a bit proactive about it, right? But the easiest thing is your network, and again, tapping into that and focusing on trust.
Makes sense, and that's all very helpful. You guys are building in the AI space. Obviously, it's very hot. Everyone's talking about it, especially like university students or even people who are professionals as well. You know, they're looking to see ways that how can they get exposure to the AI industry. What's your advice for, you know, like building in the space? You know, there's a lot of noise going around this space as well at the same time. What's your advice for building in the space or getting exposure into the space?
I think the way to think about it is that AI is frankly just like another type of technology, right? Like if you think about it, 7 to 10 years ago, if people were like, oh, I want to get exposure to mobile. Sure, they might have said it for a couple of years, but then eventually like everything is mobile, right?
Yeah.
It's the same case here. Everything is AI, right? All software will have AI in it in some way or another. And frankly, like it always has, right? Like any type of like matching algorithm, this is like often, it's just like AI has improved and there's different types of models that people are using. And so like really, I don't think the advice is any different from getting exposure to technology, right? Work with tech companies, work at tech companies, start companies, build things. And frankly, like if you're at the cutting edge of anything, you will inevitably be using AI. So even if we ended up building a non-AI SaaS startup and it was just a standard fintech startup, we would have been customers of a lot of AI products. Our engineers would have used AI co-pilots, right?
Yeah.
And so like frankly, everything will have AI in it. And so as long as you're close to startups, I think you'll get the exposure. If you want to go like deep into AI, then again, universities are a great place. Startups are a great place. San Francisco is a great place. So
Makes sense. One big thing when I speak to a lot of like younger Muslims who are thinking about building a company, it's a big risk. You know, it's scary. You might not be revenue generating. The company might fail. You know, you might be out of a job in 12 months. You know, do these thoughts, you know, go through your head? Do you have those fear? And I think especially us as like a Muslim community, you know, we are slightly more risk averse than like, you know, the wider population who go into these things. What would be your advice in terms of, you know, do you have those thoughts? How do you tackle them? What's your kind of mindset when it comes to these things?
Yeah, look, I think it's completely natural to have those fears, right? And of course I do, of course we all do. In terms of how we deal with it, look, of course there is a bit of de-risking that is like a sensible thing to do, right? But then you also have to ask yourself like, what's the worst case scenario? Again, sorry to keep quoting YC videos, but there's a recent video about how you should spend your 20s. They talk about risk and how like young people who are graduating university think about risk. And like the question they ask, like, what's the worst case scenario? And like, honestly, if you have a few years of experience at a good company, truly the worst case scenario is that you will just go and rejoin the same company or a similar company, right? Which frankly is what you would have done if you didn't start a company either, right? So what is the risk? Sure, there might be, I think the thing people weight is reputational risk. They think like, oh, if I start a company and it doesn't succeed, people will not respect me or they'll think like I failed. Frankly, I think those are the people whose judgment you should care least about. The people who respect the fact that you tried are the people that you should care about anyways. And so either way, like I don't think the reputation thing should be something that comes into people's minds.
Completely agree with that as well. Like I think the worst case scenario is that, you know, you will find a job at the end of the day. It could be your old job, could be like a different job. And I think a big thing is the fact that you have tried to build a company. You know, people will see that, people respect that, and people completely understand the fact that startups are painful. You know, startups are difficult, and the experience that you would have learned in those 1 or 2 years would have counted for so much more than continuing in your, you know, corporate job or, you know, employee job, whatever it is.
It might be more prevalent in the US, but people really respect former founders. I think even it's seeping into the rest of the world as well. Like I know even at McKinsey, I know that there was a few people that left as like associates and went to start a company. They only spent like a year and a half. The company kept going, but they came back to McKinsey. I think they decided not to continue to work on it, and they came back at a more senior role. They came back focusing on fintech work. So they kind of had like the ideal job that they wanted just by having spent like a year and a half trying to build a company, and even though it didn't really work out for them, right? And so people really respect that. A lot of YC founders want to hire former founders. In fact, our first employee, founding engineer, is also a former founder as well, and we weighted that quite highly.
Nice. One thing about startup these days is that it seems like the cool, like new, sexy thing to do. I think has become a lot more mainstream than what it was when we were in university looking for jobs.
Yeah.
But the reality is, it is quite a difficult thing to do. It does have like a rosy view from the outside. Building a startup. What do you think are some of the more difficult things that people don't really talk about, or what's some of the more like harsh realities of building a company?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, to be fair, I think like 3 or 4 years ago was like the most rosy period. And then once we started to see some layoffs and we started to see like a bit of a crunch for some fundraising, I think it was a bit difficult. But then again, there's been a new wave with AI. And so kind of, it's always cyclical, right? To answer your question, look, I think startups are all about rejection, unfortunately. And so every single day you are trying to sell your product, you're trying to get people to work with you or for you, you're trying to get people to partner with you, and you will hear no so many times. And can be very, very demotivating. Like if I give you some statistics, right? Like people, when you send cold emails, like a 3 or 4% response rate is like really high. That means for every 100 emails you send, 3 people responding to you, you should be happy about that. In fact, like that's a success, right? So that's like pretty crazy. So that means that like most people are just never going to reply to me. Same thing with fundraising. People speak to hundreds of investors. We spoke to probably 150 investors, and through our fundraising process. And a lot of people, again, like they won't reject you outright. And most people are not rude, right? So they're not going to be like, oh, you're an idiot.
Yeah.
But they will tell you, hey, like, oh, they're going to pass on you, right? If they're passing on you, it's hard not to take that personally. So I'd say like the most, like that piece about startups that's like kind of the most difficult is that it's all about rejection. And the people that overcome rejection the most are the ones that are successful.
How do you like overcome that? Do you just need to have like a confidence about you, an ego about you, just a certain mindset about it to kind of like push through it? Do you think you need to have a certain type of personality to kind of like push through this all?
I would say the first 2 things you mentioned like could help or like move you in the right direction. But like, obviously you don't want to be like, you don't want to have too much of an ego. You don't want to be like delusional about your business either. So there is this right balance that you need to have. And I think having the right people around you kind of helps. So having people around you that are optimistic. This is why I love like spending time with startup founders, even if they're not like directly working on my business, they're like encouraging, they're like pushing. When we did YC, we had 150 other companies around us also fundraising at the same time. And, we text each other and be like, oh, what did this investor say to you? Like, how are you feeling? And just like checking in on each other. And that helps a lot. So I honestly think like the healthy way to do this is to have the right community and the right team around you. Because again, sure, ego can make you do things, but like that's not really the way that you want to build your business. Right?
Yeah, completely agree. I think one of the best things I see these days is a lot of like Muslim tech communities popping up as well. I think especially in London, you got people like Deen developers, Muslimic makers, you had Muslim Tech Fest.
Yeah.
We were both in San Francisco at that time as well.
Yeah.
You're really seeing this cultivation of Muslim founders, Muslim people in tech really coming together. And it's even better with the fact that, it's people who are more like aligned with your values. I really think, this is why we're seeing this push of Muslims going into like tech jobs or building startups and all the rest of it, just because we have this good community around us.
100%. I think it's very, very powerful. And, we've seen it in a lot of other communities over the last 10 years or so. To be frank, as Muslims, we're a little bit late, but I'm glad that it is happening. And there's like some amazing people taking like community leadership. And like, this is just the beginning. Like what the team pulled off with Muslim Tech Fest in SF, like very quickly. I unfortunately wasn't able to attend like the actual conference itself, but I went to a lot of like the side events and amazing people. It's just like inevitable to me that like 3, 4, 5 years from now, that becomes something huge. And there will be people who look back and say, oh, I met my co-founder at that event. I met my investors at that event. And that's like a very powerful thing.
For sure. What's been the biggest change in your own life since, starting a company?
That's a good question. I think like, yeah, once you start a company, you truly never switch off. Like even if you thought you were a workaholic before, even if you thought you worked a lot before, like now you truly never switch off. Like you'll always be thinking about, where do I solve that next problem? It's kind of interesting because it's a lot of responsibility, but it's also kind of liberating because it feels like everything's in your control. It's like, I feel like it's the first time in my career where I can't point to somebody else and say, oh, it didn't work because of X person, which makes you take a lot of responsibility.
Is that scary at the same time?
It is definitely scary, but like you have to grow into it, right?
Yeah.
So I'm trying my best.
You're based in Dubai these days, or between Dubai and San Francisco. Any particular reason why you're building something in Dubai? Can you talk to us a little bit more about the ecosystem here and why you like it,
Sure.
the kind of problems the regions kind of have?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been based in Dubai for the last 4 years. My family's here as well, and my co-founder's here as well. So we started by setting up our team here. We do see ourselves as quite an international team. So my co-founder and I spend a lot of time in San Francisco, and frankly, we'll probably start building out our team in other geographies as well. In terms of why we decided to build from here, look, I think the main thing is that it is actually a great place to build from. There's a lot of great engineering talent here from a lot of different countries, from the UK, from Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Egypt, pretty much from everywhere. And it's honestly like improved a lot from a technical talent perspective over the last 5 years as well. So we've had some very large companies here. Obviously Kareem is here, Noon, Dubizzle. There's a bunch of other like very large companies here. And so that's helped. But then from a startup perspective as well, I think like the ecosystem has really taken off. And again, a lot of those startups have attracted a lot of talented engineers as well. So all of that's helped, and that's kind of all fed into the decision for us to build from here. I think beyond that, I think other than the US, the UAE is very, very well connected. And so it's very easy for us to go to the UK, for us to go to other markets. Now, obviously, the US is at the cutting edge of AI. I do think we live in an era where it's possible to build from Dubai or from any market for the whole world, including the US. And given that we're quite mobile, we're able to get on a plane like pretty quickly. It's very like doable for us to sell in the US. But the more customers we have in the US, I think the more time we need to spend there.
Yeah.
And frankly, like I wouldn't be surprised if we end up moving there or spending the majority of our time there.
Yeah.
In the next 12 months.
What do you see as like some of the big opportunities in the UAE and Middle East? Because you've been building here for a little while. Your previous job was a large fintech within like the Middle East, specifically within the fintech kind of space. The UAE has its like, and the Middle East as well, might not be as developed when it comes to, certain tech infrastructure in different kind of verticals, not just in fintech.
Yeah.
What do you see are like some of the big kind of verticals that people are still working on and solving for? And there are the big issues that are in the region?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a good question. Look, I think all emerging markets have similar challenges. The UAE is like pretty developed as a country, right? Like we have great infrastructure. From a tech perspective, there's a lot of people who have built a lot of cool things over the last 5 or 10 years. Fintech is frankly broken everywhere, right? Even in the US, right? Like there's a lot of issues with fintech. I still think there's huge fintech opportunities in the UAE. The first business that we wanted to start was focused on cross-border payments, and I still think that's broken. It's still too expensive. It still takes too long. It's still too hard to onboard as a customer. And that's just not just in consumer, but also business payments as well. Then I'd say the second thing is on the AI side. A lot of like the foundational model work is being done in the US, but some of it is being done here and in Europe as well. But I think the application layer is the most interesting anyways. And so on the application layer side, like our solution is also being used by fintechs in the UAE. And I think there's a lot of like AI tools like sales agents, marketing agents, whatever it might be, that are going to be adopted here. It might take a little bit longer. It might be local companies, it might be international companies that are coming in serving the market. So those are the two that I think like are really interesting. I think the third one is healthcare. Again, similar to the US, healthcare in the US is like super broken. Basically, wherever you have private healthcare, you have a lot of challenges. And so like rectifying those challenges with the technology, again, I'm sure we can do a lot of work there in the Middle East as well. And maybe less so in the UAE, but I know that for a fact in Egypt and Pakistan, these are two markets that could do with a lot more improvements in the technology infrastructure in the healthcare system.
Yeah, Saudi as well. I think Saudi's been building quite a lot. I think it's growing at a much faster rate than we're seeing in a lot of other countries. I think maybe because previously they haven't been as developed, but now they're really going through like a growth surge right now.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of cool builders in the UAE, in Saudi, in Pakistan, in Egypt as well. So all of these markets, and I'm excited to see what people build.
Rabii, thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.